As a result of domestic and global financial crisis, the federal government of Nigeria, through the central bank, conceptualized the idea of the establishment of a body that will mitigate the looming financial problem in the country. The Assets Management Company of Nigeria, AMCON, established in July 2010, was no doubt a bold move by the federal government to tackle one of the factors that for a very long time has militated against the economic growth of Nigeria. Even though AMCON has now existed for almost 10 years, it has become imperative for the federal government to take stock and, if necessary, review the operations of the agency. The ongoing dispute between AMCON and Capital Oil and Gas Industries Limited has provided the opportunity for Nigerians and indeed the government to beam a critical searchlight on AMCON and redirect the agency's energy to assist the private sector in leading the charge of developing the economy. Capital Oil and Gas Industries Limited is unarguably Nigeria's industrial giant in the downstream of the oil and gas sector. It enjoyed an enviable competitive advantage over all other companies and indeed stakeholders operating in the downstream sector, and this granted it the status of being NNPC's prime and preferred private depot operator in storage and distribution of petroleum products. That was the immutable position until AMCON whimsically decided to degrade the operations of the company in complete disregard of the strategic importance of the company, its massive capital outlay, and above all, the interest of the thousands of workers who depend on the company for their livelihood. Metaphorically, the case of Capital Oil seems like that of the goose that lays the golden eggs. But somehow, perhaps owing to poor feeding, was not laying enough eggs to meet the owner's demand. In this scenario, will a good owner kill this goose or address its feeding problems by nourishing the goose back to good health, such that it can continue to lay the golden eggs again? This analogy is what the high-handed approach and the ineptitude of AMCON in handling the business relationship between Capital Oil and Gas and some of its bankers have now become. Sometime in 2011, the federal government decided on the need to deregulate the downstream sector of the oil and gas industry. To flag off this huge policy change, the federal government set up an interministerial committee, which included the then Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Minister of Petroleum Resources, Mrs. Desiani Madueke, and the then Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Sanusi Lamido Sanusi. As a significant player well ahead of its competitors, Capital Oil and Gas Industries Limited quickly keyed into the unfolding policy by making massive strategic investments in critical areas of the sector. First, it embarked on the dredging of its jetty to accommodate big ships. The company after that acquired 19 ocean-going vessels. Perhaps most outstanding in this regard was the acquisition of a large oil tanker, MT Mongolia, with a total storage capacity of 201 million liters of petroleum products, which is the equivalent of 5 mother vessels with 30,000 metric tons. With this single acquisition, the MT Mongolia was meant to solve a considerable storage capacity problem for Nigeria. With its usage, Nigeria would be saving at least $1 million monthly on demurrage and storage costs. The massive investments were also complete with the building of a 32-arm loading gantry capable of loading 50 million liters daily. This at the time was more than Nigeria's daily product consumption. All these massive investments were made by Capital Oil in readiness for the federal government's planned deregulation of the downstream sector. With all of these investments, Capital Oil was ready. But unfortunately, and as it has now become a trend, the policy somersaults and inconsistencies that have characterized Nigeria since independence soon set in, and within a short time, in a very volatile sector like the oil and gas, the fortunes of Capital Oil and Gas dipped. Yet, in preparing itself to play a critical role in the actualization of the government's deregulation policy, Capital Oil had secured bank loans which were soon due for repayment. The loans were obtained from Access Bank, Union Bank and Zenith Bank. With Capital Oil finding it extremely difficult to navigate through the complications occasioned by the sudden change in government policy, the bank started manipulating the situation. At every turn, the figures they presented for payment were unreasonable. Left with no choice and frustrated by the attitude of the banks, the company then headed for the court. While all parties were in court, AMCON overreached itself, defined the litigations process, took over the debts owed the banks, and went further to execute a well-planned black market ex parte order from an Abuja Federal High Court to take over the company's assets in Lagos. The execution of the order involved a crude invasion of Capital Oil facilities in Lagos in June 2012. It took the same court to rescind the ex parte order when the court specifically told AMCON that it is not part of its duty to foist insolvency on the company and that the dispute, which is transactional in nature, should be resolved amicably out of court. With a clear focus to resolve its financial problem and all ancillary dispute with its creditors with the aim of improving its liquidity status, Capital Oil and Gas initiated a resolution with AMCON. All the creditors were involved in the negotiation and demanded the provision of the trade balance to Capital Oil and Gas to enable it to resume trading so that it could defray the debt to AMCON in 9 years. AMCON was positively disposed to this, particularly in line with global trends where governments were rescuing major businesses to save their economy. On AMCON recommendation, Capital Oil and Gas engaged Travant Capital as a consultant to restructure the company, and this produced terms of settlement which was developed as restructuring and facility agreement adopted as the consent judgment of the court on the 21st of June 2013. In the consent judgment, the court held that Capital Oil and Gas was merely illiquid and not insolvent. It is instructive to point out that in spite of its debt to the banks, Capital Oil's ability to operate and fully meet its obligations of supplying products and offering storage facilities to all clients, particularly the NNPC, were never affected. So, if Capital Oil was fully operational with its cutting-edge facilities, dedicated team of workers, should AMCON have assumed the role of an undertaker at this point, with the way it whimsically and capriciously moved in and closed down the company? Can a dead and dying company meet its loan obligation? Whose interest is AMCON serving? Because it couldn't have been the intention of the federal government to kill business initiatives like that of Capital Oil. These questions are begging for answers because since the crisis began, AMCON has consistently shown resistance to suggestions by the banks that Capital Oil be allowed to continue operations while AMCON pays off the bank loans on its behalf, and Capital Oil then works for AMCON to offset its obligations. Now, this would be seen to be a win-win proposition in line with AMCON's mandate. Indeed, it would seem as if all was well when this consensus position was proposed as an out-of-court settlement proposal to the court, which promptly registered it as a consent judgment. It is also necessary to point out that this consent judgment contained a clause that since Capital Oil was not insolvent but merely suffering from liquidity, AMCON shall inject a new fund of $100 million to reflate the company, which would be under a management authority. In return, the consent judgment required Capital Oil's assets to be pledged to AMCON as security. Now, rather than go ahead with the implementation of this elaborate plan to get Capital Oil and Gas working again, AMCON has been playing up all manners of subterfuge in a bid to execute its forceful takeover of Capital Oil by frustrating the full execution of the consent judgment while embarking on a systematic decapitation of the company by mismanaging its core advantages. Amcon brought in an export rate, Ryan Johansson, and within 2 years, Ryan and his team effectively grounded Capital Oil, which resulted in yet another litigation. In the fresh suit, Capital Oil documented clearly the infractions of the consent judgment by Amcon, including its refusal to inject fresh funds to reflate the company's operations, the appointment of an expatriate managing director, and the refusal to constitute a management team that will include 2 representatives of Capital Oil. Today, Capital Oil and Gas Industries Limited is in comatose, and its core advantage in terms of equipment and facilities left to wither. In practical terms, the ruins that Capital Oil has become can be seen in the following areas: destruction of the multi-million-dollar jetty owing to lack of maintenance, the collapse of the product haulage division that had 300 trucks, the collapse of the storage division, all Capital Oil filling stations shut down nationwide. Business trading partners have all abandoned Capital Oil and Gas. It should be put on record that Amcon, through its obnoxious approach, has completely grounded Capital Oil. The agency has also collected and appropriated over 19 billion naira subsidy payment due to Capital Oil and Gas, with nothing to show for it. As Capital Oil and Gas continues to pursue its legitimate grievances using the lawful judicial process, it behoves the federal government and Nigerians in general to call Amcon to order. No doubt, the objectives of setting up Amcon are laudable and salutary, but today, it is doubtful if the management of Amcon shares the reason that informed the establishment of the agency. As can be seen from the law, the core mandate of Amcon is to assist ailing businesses and to ensure that the relationship between private sector investors and their bankers do not create problems, particularly for the banks, which have given out shareholders' funds as loans. Whenever such investors and the banks have issues, Amcon's role should be to serve as the better managers, the mediator, who should be after a win-win resolution. Admittedly, it cannot be the sole aim of Amcon to constitute itself into or assume the role of an undertaker to bury every laudable concept and initiative of private investors. It is painfully regrettable that the operations of Capital Oil and Gas have been shut down, with several employees thrown into the labor market. Just as weeds have taken over the company, it is beyond doubt that Amcon is selectively implementing the consent judgment, and this cannot continue. As it stands, Capital Oil and Gas is not in any default of the terms of the consent judgment, having effectively transferred assets worth over 150 billion naira to Amcon. Amcon, as an institution with a clearly defined statutory mandate, cannot in all decency continue to overreach itself and constitute itself into a lawbreaker. It is therefore necessary for Amcon and Capital Oil and Gas Industries to halt all hostilities and return to the noble path of resolution.